Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Muneeb Ahmed with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. The US says it will not undertake a hastily pull-out of troops from Afghanistan that puts NATO forces at risk. Addressing a news conference at Pentagon, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said more progress is needed in Afghan peace talks before Western forces withdrawal. He urged all parties to decrease violence and choose the path towards peace. Meanwhile, 5 people have been killed and 2 others wounded in 3 explosions that rocked Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. Police say a woman is among those killed in the attacks. Magnetic IED blast attacks have alarmingly increased in Kabul in recent months. The US says it will not bow down to Iran's pressure before talks on returning to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. In a statement, White House said Washington does not need to take additional administrative steps to participate in revival talks. Meanwhile, diplomats say the UN nuclear watchdog has found uranium particles at 2 different Iranian sites inspected after months of stonewalling. Brazil has registered over 1,300 more COVID-19 deaths, with its toll crossing 244,000. Meanwhile, the US says its land borders with Canada and Mexico will remain closed until March 21 to control the pandemic spread. Pakistan has registered over 1,300 new cases and 36 deaths overnight, taking the toll to 12,563. Globally, the virus has claimed over 2.4 million lives and infected more than 110 million people so far. And in cricket, the Pakistan Super League is all set to woo fans with its 6th edition kicking off today. National Stadium Karachi will host the first match between reigning champions Karachi Kings and Quetta Gladiators. The Kings are aiming to retain their crown under their new head coach, Herschel Gibbs. Top stories, news in detail after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now let's have the news in detail. The United States says it will not undertake a hasty pullout of troops from Afghanistan that puts NATO forces at risk. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says more progress is needed in Afghan peace talks before Western forces withdrawal. Addressing a news conference at Pentagon, Austin said the US is mindful of the looming deadlines but wants to do this methodically and deliberately. He added Washington is committed to a responsible and sustainable end to the Afghan war.
I urge all parties to choose the path towards peace, and the violence must decrease now. I told our allies that no matter what the outcome of our review, the United States will not undertake a hasty or disorderly withdrawal from Afghanistan that puts their forces or the alliance's reputation at risk. At this time, no decisions about our future force posture have been made.
Well, this comes the day after Austin discussed Afghanistan with NATO defense ministers in Brussels. Now moving on, 5 people have been killed and 2 others wounded in 3 explosions that rocked Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. Police say a woman is among those killed in the attacks. Security forces say the first explosion targeted a civilian vehicle in the west of Kabul, in which 2 people were wounded. They said the second explosion claimed 3 lives in the Kurd-e-Parvan area of the capital, while 2 people were killed in the Pul-e-Wahdat area. However, no group has claimed responsibility for the attack so far. Magnetic IED blast attacks have alarmingly increased in the capital in recent months. More than 50 people have been killed and 70 more wounded in Kabul attacks during the past 30 days. Now, China's army has honored 2 military officers and 3 soldiers for defending the country's western border. The military also shared a video showing Indian forces trespassing Ladakh River while Chinese troops attempt to stop them. Details in this report.
Galwan Valley border clash in June last year left 20 Indian soldiers dead, while 4 Chinese also lost their lives. The Indian military violated the previous consensus and trespassed the line of actual control and built tents. They attacked the Chinese soldiers by using steel tubes and cudgels and throwing stones. But the Indian military was utterly defeated, with many running away while leaving many injured and dead. Inspired by the spirit of those deceased compatriots, Chinese soldiers stationed on the front line intensified their efforts to defend the border.
The heroic deeds have greatly inspired the fighting will of the officers and soldiers. Now it is the coldest time of the year, but we are in high spirit to defend our country's border. We would rather die here than losing an inch of our land.
China says new equipment has been deployed to the frontier stations and logistic supplies have also been updated for soldiers stationed along the border areas.
Well, now the US says it will not bow to Iran's pressure before talks on returning to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. White House says Washington does not need to take additional administrative steps to participate in revival talks.
Talking to reporters, White House spokesperson Jen Psaki said the EU has invited the US for talks over the JCPOA, but she added it is simply an invitation to have a diplomatic conversation. Psaki said the US has no plan to withdraw so-called snapback sanctions against Iran. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Iran is much closer to being able to produce a nuclear weapon. In an interview, he said the policy of so-called maximum pressure of previous U.S. administration against Iran has not produced results. Meanwhile, diplomats said the UN nuclear watchdog has found uranium particles at 2 Iranian sites it inspected after months of stonewalling. They said the watchdog is preparing to rebuke Tehran for failing to explain this to the agency.
Well, now the US has condemned the use of force against peaceful protesters in Myanmar, urging the military to refrain from violence. Yesterday, a young woman became the first protester to die in the anti-coup demonstrations in Myanmar. State Department spokesperson Ned Price said the U.S. is saddened by reports of protesters' death. The army says 1 policeman has also died of injuries sustained in a protest. Meanwhile, members of Myanmar ethnic groups staged a protest in a show of opposition to the coup. The protesters have been demanding the restoration of the elected government and the release of all detainees. They have called for the scrapping of a 2008 constitution that was drawn up under army supervision and gives it a decisive role in politics. Meanwhile, the internet remained suspended in the country for the 6th consecutive night. Moving on now, Saudi Arabia has announced to invest more than $20 billion in its domestic military industry over the next decade. In a press briefing, defense industry regulator head Ahmed bin Abdul Aziz Al Ohali said $10 billion will be spent on research and development. The move is part of Riyadh's aim to manufacture more weapons and military systems domestically. He said for this purpose, Saudi Arabia will spend 50% of its military budget locally by 2030. Now, Brazil has registered over 1,300 more COVID-19 deaths, with its toll crossing 244,000. The U.S. says its land borders with Canada and Mexico will remain closed until March 21 to control the pandemic spread. Globally, the virus has claimed over 2.4 million lives and infected more than 110 million people so far. More on the coronavirus in this report.
Ravaging cases, hindering curbs, political scandals, and extreme weather are affecting the nation's respective fights against the virus. Canada's largest city, Toronto, has extended the curbs until at least 8 March, despite schools only just starting up again. Argentina's health minister has resigned, following reports that people had been able to use connections to get access to vaccines to which they were not entitled. In the United States, about 6 million vaccines have been temporarily delayed due to the frigid weather. However, President Joe Biden expressed hope the vaccination drive in the U.S. can be concluded by July.
So we will have ordered, much of which will have been distributed, over 600 million doses by the end of July. July 29th is the expected date. But that could change. Look what's happening with the weather now, for example. It's slowing up the distribution right now. But I believe we'll be approaching normalcy by the end of this year, and God willing, this Christmas will be different than last.
In Europe, Italy is investigating fake vaccines after regional officials received an offer to buy 27 million doses outside of the EU procurement system. Greece has extended lockdown restrictions to more areas of the country to stem the spread of the infection. The Dutch senators have approved a law underpinning the country's curfew until at least early March despite the court orders to lift curbs. Meanwhile, philanthropist Bill Gates said a politically sensitive gap between vaccinating people in wealthy and developing countries could narrow to half a year. Gates also urged the world for universal efforts against any future such crisis.
So the tools, the R&D side needs to be funded, and the field capacity, the factories, the surveillance, that team of 3,000. But these investments will have fantastic returns even when there's not a pandemic. And, I have very little doubt that, given what a tragedy this has been this time around, over the next 5 years, we'll get those things in place.
In Central Africa, 2 people have died as protests against new COVID-19 restrictions in Gabon degenerated into a standoff in 2 major cities.
Now in Pakistan, 36 people have died of COVID-19 and more than 1,300 tested positive for the virus overnight. The Health Ministry says the nationwide death toll has reached 12,563. It said nearly 570,000 people contracted the virus so far, out of which over 533,000 have recovered. The ministry said at present there are more than 24,000 active cases in Pakistan. It added over 2,000 patients are admitted in the hospitals across the country. Pakistan Navy has conducted joint exercises with Russian and Sri Lankan naval forces which mark the end of Aman 21 drill. Pakistan Navy spokesperson says the drills have been held in the North Arabian Sea. The aerial assets of the Pakistan Navy and Air Force participated in the exercise. Navy says the drills were conducted to further enhance cooperation and interoperability with fleets of Russia and Sri Lanka. Earlier, Naval Chief Admiral Muhammad Amjad Khan Niazi visited ships of Russia, Indonesia and Sri Lanka. The Admiral met with the commanding officers and the crew of the foreign aircraft participating in the exercise. Now, an Indian court has extended the detention of climate activist Disha Ravi over a guide for anti-government farmers' protest. Ravi has been charged with sedition over creating protest toolkit. Ravi's arrest has raised concerns about a crackdown on dissent and prompted other climate activists to raise a voice. Swedish climate campaigner Greta Thunberg has tweeted her support for Ravi. Taking to Twitter, she wrote, "Freedom of speech are non-negotiable human rights." Meanwhile, another farmer has passed away during protests at Delhi border due to a heart attack. According to the farmer unions, this has pushed the total number of farmers' deaths to 208. Meanwhile, Human Rights Watch says Indian government policies and actions discriminate against Muslims and stigmatize its critics. The international rights body said the prejudices of the ruling BJP has infiltrated independent institutions. The group said the police and the courts empower nationalist groups to threaten, harass and attack religious minorities with impunity. In a statement, it said February 23rd will mark the first anniversary of the communal violence in Delhi that killed 53 people, including 40 Muslims. The rights body said instead of conducting a credible probe, the authorities have targeted activists and protest organizers. It added this time the government has responded to farmers' mass demonstrations by vilifying minority Sikh protesters. Director Meenakshi Ganguly said that the Indian government is providing political patronage and cover to the bigotry. More news coming up in this bulletin after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now let's move on with the news stories. The United Nations says Palestinian socio-economic development has suffered one of its worst years since 1994. Office of the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process said almost half of the Palestinian population requires humanitarian aid. In a report, it said the protracted humanitarian crisis in the country has been exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic. The office described 2020 as a year of setbacks for Palestinians, their institutions and economy due to the pandemic. It said vaccines have begun arriving in the occupied Palestinian territory through the efforts of the WHO and UNICEF. Now, the UN says Libya National Army agrees to commit and facilitate the national elections on the 24th of December 2021. The UN Special Envoy for Libya, Jan Kiris, met with the commander of the Eastern-based army, General Khalifa Haftar, in Benghazi. In a statement, the UN mission to Libya said the meeting is part of Kiris's first visit to the country, where he met with officials and interlocutors. It said the envoy and Haftar discussed ways to expedite the full implementation of a ceasefire signed on 23rd of October last year. Kiris reiterated the urgent need to cease all international interference in Libya. He stressed all countries must respect the UN Security Council resolutions. The meeting took place in the presence of Libya's 5+5 Joint Military Commissions delegation. Now, Thailand's Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha and 9 ministers have survived a no-confidence motion in the parliament. The vote marks the second no-confidence that Prayut's government has faced since taking office in July 2019. The President of the National Assembly, Chauhan Leekpai, announced the widely expected results. Chauhan said the 272 to 206 vote with 3 abstentions showed that there is confidence in Prayut. The consensus motion required a simple majority comprising 244 votes to pass.
The number of those who doesn't agree to vote for no confidence is 272. 3 abstained from voting. In conclusion, the vote of those who doesn't agree is more than the required number of the total MPs. Therefore, the vote shows that there is confidence.
The UN says the scale of violence in South Sudan is a lot worse than during the country's 5-year civil war. In a report, the UN Human Rights Commission accused senior officials of supporting the armed groups. Commission's chairperson Yasmin Sulkar said violence is continuing in South Sudan. She said it is now localized and differs from the civil war involving community leaders and militias. Sulkar said the attack on civilians are being carried out along ethnic lines, often backed by armed state and opposition forces. Hundreds of people were killed last year alone, while millions are still struggling to recover from the civil war that ended in 2018. Now, a group of 25 asylum seekers have entered the U.S. from a port of entry in San Ysidro, California. This marks the start of U.S. President Joe Biden's effort to unwind one of his predecessor's most restrictive immigration policies. The asylum seekers will now quarantine in a local hotel and wait for their cases to be heard in immigration courts. Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security said the effort will expand in the coming week. Earlier on Thursday, the Democrats formally introduced Biden's sweeping immigration bill in Congress. The legislation will provide a path to citizenship for an estimated 11 million illegal immigrants in the U.S. Now, the European Union says it's willing to join forces with the U.S. to counter challenges on climate change and digital marketing rules. The bloc's chief executive, Ursula von der Leyen, made the remarks at Munich Security Conference. Leyen said a shared transatlantic commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 will make climate neutrality a new global benchmark. She termed the United States a natural partner for global leadership on climate change. The EU chief added, together, Washington and Brussels can create a digital economy rulebook that is valid worldwide.
Today, I want to invite our American friends to join our initiatives. Together, we could create a digital economy rulebook that is valid worldwide. A set of rules based on our values: human rights and pluralism, inclusion, and the protection of privacy.
Now, severe flooding in the Indonesian capital Jakarta has forced more than 1,000 people to flee their homes. Jakarta's Governor Anies Baswedan said 200 neighborhoods have been affected across the capital. The governor said more than 24 evacuation centers have been prepared across the city. City's disaster mitigation agency said floodwaters reached up to 1.8 meters high in some areas. The country's meteorology agency has warned that extreme weather is expected throughout next week. So far, no casualties have been reported in the flooding. Well, defying odds, a courageous Iraqi woman has entered a male-dominated sector. The valiant 36-year-old woman has been working as the only female car mechanic of Baghdad for years. More about her bravery in this report.
Maysun Abdurrahim has studied language and literature at university. After graduating, she looked for an appropriate position in the field. She was not satisfied with the jobs available and decided to stand up against the norms and started following her father's footsteps.
I learned this job from my father. He used to stand by me and teach me how to repair the engine. I started to repair Japanese-made cars when I was 14 years old.
Maysun recalls that how some customers coming to her father's repair shop were surprised to see her, but she has never faced any community pressure or any objection.
When I was working with my father, people who came to the garage were surprised to see me. However, I didn't face any community pressure or any objection.
Maysun is not only a car mechanic, but also an expert electrician and plumber too. Her customers are satisfied with her mechanical work.
This is the first time that I've seen a female car mechanic, but I didn't see any flaws in her work. There are women in my profession too, male drivers who see the female mechanic, may be hesitant at first, but then they can see that her work is as good as any male car mechanics.
Maysun Abdurrahim dreams of starting her own business when she can afford to do so.
Well, now the famous US TV reality star Kim Kardashian has filed for divorce from her rapper husband, Kanye West. The filing follows months of rumors that the relationship between the two celebrities was on the rocks. Let's find out more in this report.
Fashion mogul Kim Kardashian, who made her name from the reality TV series Keeping Up with the Kardashians, has officially parted ways with her husband Kanye West. Christy Welder, a representative for Kim, has confirmed the divorce filing. The couple had been married for almost 7 years and have 4 children together. Kim has asked for joint legal and physical custody of their children. The two, who married in a lavish wedding in Italy in 2014, have been living apart for some time. Their relationship became strained last year when Kanye West ran an unsuccessful campaign marked by statements to be elected as a U.S. president.
Now, China has registered an online retail sales volume of around $139 billion over the past 30 days. The remarkable online consumption made China's Spring Festival market flourish. A 30-day shopping festival launched by Ministry of Commerce concluded with total online retail sales of over $139 billion. According to Ministry's data, online sales of the catering industry obtained a 48.5% growth year-on-year, while sales related to Lunar New Year's Eve dinner jumped by nearly 79%. Moviegoers also contributed more than $1.39 billion through online bookings. Now in cricket, the Pakistan Super League is all set to woo fans with its 6th edition kicking off today. National Stadium Karachi will host the first match between reigning champions Karachi Kings and Quetta Gladiators. For the first time in nearly a year, crowds will be present at the venues up to 20% capacity. The Kings are aiming to retain their crown under their new head coach, Harshal Gibbs. Batting is Karachi's strength, with Sharjeel Khan, Colin Ingram and Babar Azam capable of booming strike rates. Meanwhile, Quetta have a deadly bowling trio at their disposal in Mohammad Hasnan, Naseem Shah and Usman Shinwari. With all preparations made after a star-studded draft, fans are eagerly waiting the fascinating few weeks of T20 cricket. And now let's have a look at how the weather is doing around the world. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.